Part 2, Chapter 10, Filibusters, A Fatal Morning, Section 1b. But at this point Yulia Mihailovna suddenly broke her silence and sternly announced that she had long been aware of these criminal designs, and that it was all foolishness, and that he had taken it too seriously, and that as for these mischievous fellows, she knew not only those four, but all of them (it was a lie), but that she had not the faintest intention of going out of her mind on account of it, but, on the contrary, had all the more confidence in her intelligence, and hoped to bring it all to a harmonious conclusion, to encourage the young people, to bring them to reason, to show them suddenly and unexpectedly that their designs were known, and then to point out to them new aims for rational and more noble activity. Oh, how can I describe the effect of this on Andrey Antonovitch? Hearing that Pyotr Stepanovitch had duped him again and had made a fool of him so coarsely, that he had told her much more than he had told him, and sooner than him, and that perhaps Pyotr Stepanovitch was the chief instigator of all these criminal designs, he flew into a frenzy. "Senseless but malignant woman!" he cried, snapping his bonds at one blow. "Let me tell you, I shall arrest your worthless lover at once. I shall put him in fetters and send him to the fortress, or I shall jump out of a window before your eyes this minute." Yulia Mihailovna, turning green with anger, greeted this tirade at once with a burst of prolonged, ringing laughter, going off into peals such as one hears at the French theatre when a Parisian actress, imported for a fee of 100,000 to play a coquette, laughs in her husband's face for daring to be jealous of her. Von Lembke rushed to the window, but suddenly stopped as though rooted to the spot, folded his arms across his chest, and, white as a corpse, looked with a sinister gaze at the laughing lady. "Do you know, Yulia, do you know," he said in a gasping and suppliant voice, "do you know that even I can do something?" But at the renewed and even louder laughter that followed his last words, he clenched his teeth, groaned, and suddenly rushed, not towards the window, but at his spouse, with his fist raised. He did not bring it down. No, I repeat again and again, no. But it was the last straw. He ran to his own room, not knowing what he was doing, flung himself, dressed as he was, face downwards on his bed, wrapped himself convulsively, head and all, in the sheet, and lay so for 2 hours, incapable of sleep, incapable of thought, with a load on his heart and blank, immovable despair in his soul. Now and then he shivered all over with an agonizing, feverish tremor. Disconnected and irrelevant things kept coming into his mind. At one minute he thought of the old clock which used to hang on his wall 15 years ago in Petersburg and had lost the minute hand. At another of the cheerful clerk, Millebois, and how they had once caught a sparrow together in Alexandrovsky Park, and had laughed so that they could be heard all over the park, remembering that one of them was already a college assessor. I imagine that about 7 in the morning he must have fallen asleep without being aware of it himself, and must have slept with enjoyment, with agreeable dreams. Waking about 10 o'clock, he jumped wildly out of bed, remembered everything at once, and slapped himself on the head. He refused his breakfast, and would see neither Blum nor the chief of the police, nor the clerk who came to remind him that he was expected to preside over a meeting that morning. He would listen to nothing, and did not want to understand. He ran like one possessed to Yulia Mihailovna's part of the house. There Sophia Andropovna, an old lady of good family who had lived for years with Yulia Mihailovna, explained to him that his wife had set off at 10 o'clock that morning with a large company in 3 carriages to Varvara Petrovna Stavrogin's, to Skvoreshniki to look over the place, with a view to the second fête which was planned for a fortnight later, and that the visit to day had been arranged with Varvara Petrovna 3 days before. Overwhelmed with this news, Andrey Antonovitch returned to his study and impulsively ordered the horses. He could hardly wait for them to be got ready. His soul was hungering for Yulia Mihailovna, to look at her, to be near her for 5 minutes. Perhaps she would glance at him, notice him, would smile as before, forgive him. Oh, aren't the horses ready? Mechanically he opened a thick book lying on the table. He sometimes used to try his fortune in this way with a book, opening it at random and reading the 3 lines at the top of the right hand page. What turned up was "Tu es pour le mieux dans le milieu du monde possible. Voltaire, Candide." He uttered an ejaculation of contempt and ran to get into the carriage. "Skvoreshniki!" The coachman said afterwards that his master urged him on all the way. But as soon as they were getting near the mansion he suddenly told him to turn and drive back to the town, bidding him drive fast, please drive fast. Before they reached the town wall, master told me to stop again, got out of the carriage and went across the road into the field. I thought he felt ill, but he stopped and began looking at the flowers. And so he stood for a time. It was strange, really. I began to feel quite uneasy. This was the coachman's testimony. I remember the weather that morning. It was a cold, clear, but windy September morning. Before Andrey Antonovitch stretched a forbidding landscape of bare fields from which the crop had long been harvested. There were a few dying yellow flowers, pitiful relics blown about by the howling wind. Did he want to compare himself and his fate with those wretched flowers battered by the autumn and the forest? I don't think so. In fact, I feel sure it was not so, and that he realized nothing about the flowers in spite of the evidence of the coachman and of the police superintendent, who drove up at that moment and asserted afterwards that he found the governor with a bunch of yellow flowers in his hand. This police superintendent, Flibusterov by name, was an ardent champion of authority, who had only recently come to our town, but had already distinguished himself and become famous by his inordinate zeal, by a certain vehemence in the execution of his duties, and his inveterate inebriety. Jumping out of the carriage and not the least disconcerted at the sight of what the governor was doing, he blurted out all in one breath with a frantic expression, yet with an air of conviction, that "there's an upset in the town." "Eh? What?" said Andrey Antonovitch, turning to him with a stern face, but without a trace of surprise or any recollection of his carriage and his coachman, as though he had been in his own study. "Police Superintendent Flibusterov, your Excellency. There's a riot in the town." "Filibusters?" Andrey Antonovitch said thoughtfully. "Just so, your Excellency. The Shpigulin men are making a riot." "The Shpigulin men?" The name Shpigulin seemed to remind him of something. He started and put his finger to his forehead. "The Shpigulin men." In silence, and still plunged in thought, he walked without haste to the carriage, took his seat, and told the coachman to drive to the town. The police superintendent followed in the droshky. I imagined that he had vague impressions of many interesting things of all sorts on the way, but I doubt whether he had any definite idea or any settled intention as he drove into the open space in front of his house. But no sooner did he see the resolute and orderly ranks of the rioters, the cordon of police, the helpless, and perhaps purposely helpless, chief of police, and the general expectation of which he was the object, then all the blood rushed to his heart. With a pale face he stepped out of the carriage. "Caps off," he said breathlessly and hardly audibly. "On your knees," he squealed to the surprise of every one, to his own surprise too, and perhaps the very unexpectedness of the position was the explanation of what followed. Can a sledge on a switchback at carnival stop short as it flies down the hill? What made it worse, Andrey Antonovitch had been all his life serene in character, and never shouted or stamped at any one, and such people are always the most dangerous if it once happens that something sets their sledge sliding downhill. Everything was whirling before his eyes. "Filibusters!" he yelled still more shrilly and absurdly, and his voice broke. He stood, not knowing what he was going to do, but knowing and feeling in his whole being that he would certainly do something directly. "Lord!" was heard from the crowd. A lad began crossing himself. 3 or 4 men actually did try to kneel down, but the whole mass moved 3 steps forward, and suddenly all began talking at once. "Your Excellency! We were hired for a term. The manager! You mustn't say!" and so on and so on. It was impossible to distinguish anything. Alas, Andrey Antonovitch could distinguish nothing. The flowers were still in his hands. The riot was as real to him as the prison carts were to Stepan Trofimovitch. and flitting to and fro in the crowd of rioters who gazed open-eyed at him, he seemed to see Pyotr Stepanovitch, who had egged them on, Pyotr Stepanovitch whom he hated and whose image had never left him since yesterday. "Rods!" he cried even more unexpectedly. A dead silence followed. From the facts I have learnt and those I have conjectured, this must have been what happened at the beginning, but I have no such exact information for what followed, nor can I conjecture it so easily. There are some facts, however. In the first place, rods were brought on the scene with strange rapidity. They had evidently been got ready beforehand in expectation by the intelligent chief of the police. Not more than 2 or at most 3 were actually flogged. However, that fact I wish to lay stress on. It's an absolute fabrication to say that the whole crowd of rioters, or at least half of them, were punished. It is a nonsensical story, too, that a poor but respectable lady was caught as she passed by and promptly thrashed. Yet I read myself an account of this incident afterwards among the provincial items of a Petersburg newspaper. Many people in the town talked of an old woman called Avdotya Petrovna Tarapygin, who lived in the almshouse by the cemetery. She was said, on her way home from visiting a friend, to have forced her way into the crowd of spectators through natural curiosity. Seeing what was going on, she cried out, "What a shame!" and spat on the ground. For this it was said she had been seized and flogged too. This story not only appeared in print, but in our excitement we positively got up a subscription for her benefit. I subscribed 20 kopecks myself. And would you believe it? It appears now that there was no old woman called Tarapygin living in the almshouse at all. I went to inquire at the almshouse by the cemetery myself. They had never heard of anyone called Tarapygin there, and what's more, they were quite offended when I told them the story that was going round. I mention this fabulous Avdotya Petrovna because what happened to her, if she really had existed, very nearly happened to Stepan Trofimovitch. Possibly, indeed, his adventure may have been at the bottom of the ridiculous tale about the old woman; that is, as the gossip went on growing, he was transformed into this old dame. What I find most difficult to understand is how he came to slip away from me as soon as he got into the square. As I had a misgiving of something very unpleasant, I wanted to take him round the square straight to the entrance to the governor's, but my own curiosity was roused, and I stopped only for 1 minute to question the first person I came across, and suddenly I looked round and found Stepan Trofimovitch no longer at my side. Instinctively I darted off to look for him in the most dangerous place. Something made me feel that his sledge, too, was flying downhill. And I did, as a fact, find him in the very centre of things. I remember I seized him by the arm, but he looked quietly and proudly at me with an air of immense authority. "Cher," he pronounced, in a voice which quivered on a breaking note, "if they are dealing with people so unceremoniously before us, in an open square, what is to be expected from that man, for instance, if he happens to act on his own authority?" And shaking with indignation and with an intense desire to defy them, he pointed a menacing, accusing finger at Flibusterov, who was gazing at us open-eyed 2 paces away. "That man!" cried the latter, blind with rage. "What man? And who are you?" He stepped up to him, clenching his fist. "Who are you?" he roared ferociously, hysterically, and desperately. I must mention that he knew Stepan Trofimovitch perfectly well by sight. Another moment and he would have certainly seized him by the collar, but luckily, hearing him shout, Lemke turned his head. He gazed intensely but with perplexity at Stepan Trofimovitch, seeming to consider something, and suddenly he shook his hand impatiently. Flibusterov was checked. I drew Stepan Trofimovitch out of the crowd, though perhaps he may have wished to retreat himself. "Home, home," I insisted. "It was certainly thanks to Lemke that we were not beaten." "Go, my friend. I am to blame for exposing you to this. You have a future and a career of a sort before you, while I... mon heure est sonné." He resolutely mounted the governor's steps. The hall porter knew me. I said that we both wanted to see Yulia Mihailovna. We sat down in the waiting room and waited. I was unwilling to leave my friend, but I thought it unnecessary to say anything more to him. He had the air of a man who had consecrated himself to certain death for the sake of his country. We sat down, not side by side, but in different corners, I nearer to the entrance, he at some distance facing me, with his head bent in thought, leaning lightly on his stick. He held his wide brimmed hat in his left hand. We sat like that for 10 minutes. End of Part Two, Chapter 10, Section 1b.